Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm Charles Lichfield. I'm the Deputy Director of the Geoeconomics Center at the Atlantic Council. And we're very happy to be followed by very many of you everywhere for this event, which is launching our new report on outbound investment screening. We're very happy that this event is being held in collaboration with the Center for a New American Security. This report is the result of consultations, workshops between the elite of American thinking, of American brains on economic statecraft. There have been many proposals floating around in Washington on outbound investment screening. Now that inbound investment screening is a part of the American toolkit, and allies have also followed America's leadership on inbound investment screening. Outbound investment screening is the new direction that some would like us to go in. And the workshops have been very, very interesting discussions, which we're very grateful to our two co-authors to have summarized into a report we're launching today. The purposes of this event is to present that report to you. The report was only published this morning, so we can't expect any of the people who have dialed in to have read it yet, but we're very lucky to have the two co-authors who will summarize it. And then we're also very lucky to have Peter Harrell from the National Security Council, who will be providing a few remarks on the work that's going on there and potential policy responses. So I'll just introduce our speakers very, very briefly, and then I'll hand over to Sarah and Emily, our two co-authors, to take you through the report, and then we'll move on to Peter. But we're very happy to have Emily Kilcrease of the Center for New American Security. We're also very happy to have Sarah Bauerle Danzman, who is professor at the University of Indiana and also one of our own senior fellows here at the Geoeconomics Center at the Atlantic Council. And as I said, Peter Harrell, also the Senior Director for International Economics and Competitiveness on the NSC, will also be joining us, providing remarks in about 10 minutes. But I'll stop now and hand over to Emily and Sarah to take you through the report, and I'll be back in about 20 minutes to go through the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Charles, and thank you to the Atlantic Council team and to Sarah in particular for the excellent collaboration on this project over the last several months through many working groups and drafts back and forth. It is great to see this report out there. Sarah and I had the pleasure of working in the CFIUS process years ago together, and many of the recommendations that we're making are informed by our firsthand experience in that process. And I'll add my thanks to Peter as well for joining us. We know he's very busy on a lot of issues, so we're glad to give him a break from Russia sanctions and other things that may be taking up his time and give him a chance to think about something else for a few hours here. I want to start us off with a few big picture framing comments that are important to keep in mind as we consider where outbound investment fits into a broader economic statecraft or economic security landscape. And at the outset, it's worth being quite clear about the fact that a new outbound investment mechanism could be highly disruptive. US firms have significant investments in China. Complex global supply chains run through China, and China remains an essential market for many US firms. By noting these dynamics, we're not trying to argue that we shouldn't do outbound investment screening or controls. And to the contrary, Sarah and I took this project on because we do think there's an urgent national security need to have some sort of regulatory authority in this space. But it does mean that policymakers need to proceed with deliberateness and intention to scope a new set of outbound investment controls quite carefully. To that end, our paper contributes to the ongoing policy discussion by first proposing a narrowly scoped policy objective for a new regime on outbound investment screening, and second, by laying out a set of principles that should guide the development of these new authorities. In terms of the policy objective, there have been several different goals that have come up in various pieces of this debate and that we've heard from various of the stakeholders that we've talked to throughout the course of our work. This includes whether US investments in China and controls on such investments could address human rights concerns, for example, by prohibiting US investments into companies that are known to be complicit with China's systemic abuse of human rights. We've heard concerns about whether outbound investment is contributing to supply chain issues, particularly related to offshoring or outsourcing of critical capabilities or critical technologies of the United States. We note that all of these are worthy policy problems to study and to work on. But our research found that in many cases, the United States has existing authorities that can address these particular types of concerns. And in some cases, if you do a bit of expansion or reform of existing authorities, those are actually a much better match between policy objective and policy mechanism. For example, it's our view that using outbound investment controls to deal with offshoring doesn't quite work, because what you really need to do is to address the underlying commercial drivers that are leading firms to believe that offshoring is in their commercial best interest. And so, for example, things like the CHIPS and Science Act and an affirmative industrial policy are far more likely to be effective in trying to address that particular set of issues. However, where we did see that there was a significant gap in existing authorities that would be suitable to address through an outbound investment control is with respect to how US capital can support China's indigenous technology development. US investments, including the flows of capital and the associated flows of management expertise, business networks, supply chain know-how, and other intangible benefits that can flow with an investment, can contribute to the overall capacity of China to grow and mature in critical technology areas. Importantly, these investment benefits are distinct from any particular transfer of technology that may also be associated with the investment. As many of our audience will know, transfers of technology are already regulated through US export controls. And the export control regime should continue to be the primary mechanism for guarding against the transfer of sensitive technology. But the types of investment-related benefits that we're concerned with, such as management expertise, are not the kinds of things that can be described and regulated in the same way that a technology item can. And it's to capture these sorts of concerns that an outbound investment control mechanism can be most helpful. Outbound investment controls must work hand in hand with export controls to ensure that there's not duplication between the two sets of authorities. Our recommendations are focused on having outbound investment controls focus on capital that supports the indigenous development of technology in China and focus on technology that would be controlled if it was originating in the United States. For example, in the semiconductor space, if FPGAs or now GPUs cannot be exported to China under our export control laws, then US investors should equally be precluded from investing in Chinese capacity to develop these exact technologies domestically. With that strict focus on policy objectives of regulating the flow of capital that can make a meaningful contribution to the indigenous growth of critical technology in China, we also in our paper set forth a series of principles that should guide the design of exactly how a system of outbound investment control should work. We believe that the mechanism or authorities should focus on a national security risk assessment and not be expanded to a broader set of economic security or competitiveness concerns. And at the outset, particularly as a new mechanism is being stood up, the control should focus on the highest set of high-risk transactions. We shouldn't try to capture everything. We should get at the areas of the most substantial risk. The control should be designed to create clear rules for the private sector, including clear definitions of exactly what types of investment transactions and what sectors are covered. The private sector is always the first line of compliance, and they need to have very clear guidance on what they're complying with. And this is particularly important for sectors like, for example, artificial intelligence, which encompass a range of goods and services and don't line up neatly with existing tariff codes. A new outbound investment regime should be non-duplicative of existing authorities and should function as a tool of last resort. Outbound investment authorities should only be used when other authorities cannot adequately address a risk arising from a particular transaction that may be covered. It should also be scoped appropriately to align with the institutional capacity to implement new authorities. These sorts of authorities are really complex and take large numbers of well-trained staff to implement them effectively. All of that takes time and money to build well. And the CFIUS process, for example, which regulates inbound investment, that's a process that involves hundreds of staff across multiple agencies and has been refined and reformed over decades. So when we say we're setting up a CFIUS-like mechanism here, we should keep that in mind. That's a huge effort, and it takes a lot of work to do well. And last but certainly not least, the United States must make the case to allies about the need for outbound investment controls in their jurisdictions as well. As with export controls or other forms of economic statecraft, outbound investment controls will have the most effect if they're implemented by large portions of the global economy. This is particularly true for capital flows. Money is fungible after all. And there's a high risk that capital from other countries could backfill for US investors if the United States tackles this issue alone. With that, I will hand it over to Sarah with one final comment, which is that we know that our approach in our paper is phased, it is deliberate, and there may be people who read our paper and think it's too slow and not quick enough, and that the issue is so urgent that we need to act quickly. And I think Sarah and I would both agree with the urgency of the issue. But our view is that the deliberate phased approach that allows us to build the capacity and make the case with allies is the quickest way to get to a mechanism that is durable and effective over the long term. I think we've seen plenty of cases where we have executive orders that are issued, and they're basically just a piece of paper because there's no institutional mechanism behind them to actually implement them well. And so that was really one of the driving factors of many of our recommendations, is how do we most quickly get to a most effective, most durable sort of regime. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you all for being here for today. And I want to also echo Emily's thanks to so many people who have made this process possible. When it became clear that there was increased appetite for outbound measures in Congress back in January and February, we, meaning both the Atlantic Council and CNAS, engaged just a brilliant working group comprised of experts within government, legal, industry, and financial experience professionals to talk through these issues. And from that process, which took place through the spring and summer, Emily and I developed a proposal for a comprehensive policy on investment controls that we think has the best chance of addressing the national security concerns that outbound investment can create, while also being narrowly enough scope to retain the US's longstanding general policy of economic openness. While it would be wrong, I think, to call this policy brief a consensus document from that working group process, it is also true that we are enormously indebted to those those who participated in the process. Unfortunately, Chatham House rules precludes me from mentioning them by name, but you know who you are, and we are deeply grateful for the investment of time that you made in helping us think through the challenges of an outbound control process. We want to get to asking Peter his thoughts, but as mentioned by Charles at the outset, since our report just came out today, we assume that most of you have not had time to read the full report. I encourage you to do so because we go into greater detail about our proposals there. But to provide a top level summary, I want to just briefly go over how we develop or what we're suggesting in this report. And as Emily mentioned, we take a deliberate phased approach. The general idea is that it's hard to build a plane while you're simultaneously trying to fly it. So that's our kind of general approach. Another important point that I want to make is that the kind of regulatory response that's going to be most helpful for advanced and foundational technologies is not necessarily going to work as well for emerging technology. Anyone who has followed the export control kind of process understands this problem. Because to control an item, you have to understand what it does and what its general use is. Emerging technology by its nature is just too inchoate for us to have the answers to those basic questions. So one of the other things that we're trying to do in our report is try to think about ways to develop policy solutions that can cover both of these types of technologies. So what are these key policy recommendations? So the first phase would work kind of in 4 ways, right? So we have a rather broad mandatory notification regime for outbound investments to better inform policymakers about the size of the problem. This will help to focus the attention of any outbound review process on what matters the most, what sort of bureaucratic funding is needed to stand up this process, and also, quite frankly, to socialize partners and allies to the needs of the regulatory responses in this area, which is really essential to bringing others along for the ride. We imagine notifications would cover transactions that involve the acquisition by a U.S. person or entities controlled by a U.S. person of a Chinese entity that produces, designs, tests, manufactures, fabricates, or develops verbs that all of us in CFIUS and export control know well. Any item that would be controlled under U.S. export controls if it originated from the US. And additionally, we could also include technologies that are not currently controlled, but are listed on the White House's critical and emerging technologies list, although there might need to be some changes or some kind of clarification on that, because some of those technologies as listed are currently very broad. Concurrent to that, we recommend creating a mirror image investment control to prohibit US investment in Chinese firms that make technologies that are subject to an arms embargo. And we can talk more in Q&A if people are interested about kind of what exactly that would cover, as well as the technical changes that would be necessary to current regulation that this would require. The third thing we suggest is on this issue of emerging technologies and venture capital. So to more clearly address these risks, we recommend expanding the CMIC sanctions program to allow the US government to add Chinese companies, whether publicly traded or privately held, that operate in sectors important to US national security. So the CMIC list, for those who are not familiar with it, prohibits US investment in listed entities. And in the past, this has been used mostly for listed firms that are very clearly associated with the Chinese military industrial complex. So we suggest that the US use the regulatory process to kind of broaden the scope of what types of companies could be covered on this list, and to develop a quite narrow subset of technology subfields from the critical and emerging technologies list to focus on. And the idea here is that then the US government can provide guidance to US investors so they know what technologies the US views as most sensitive to national security, and therefore most likely to lead to a Chinese entity being placed on the CMIC list in the future. And the idea here is this is forward guidance to firms, and particularly to venture capital, because if there's a high likelihood of a CMIC listing in the future associated with a particular technology, it will be very hard for US investors to justify early stage participation in Chinese entities that are likely to develop such sensitive technology, because there wouldn't be clear off-ramps from the investment at later stages of financing. We also suggest pairing this more forward-leaning use of the CMIC list with greater rules around disclosing what types of investments venture capital is making into Chinese entities. We also recommend that once this kind of process is created, that there's a general policy of cross-listing between the entity list and the CMIC list to prevent entity listings from having access to US capital markets. And finally, as Emily mentioned, we also recommend engaging in serious and sustained diplomatic outreach to encourage partners and allies to develop similar controls. So that's the first stage. And then the second stage would be, we would assume, a year to 18 months later, and this would be where we would stand up a mandatory review process for US investments. We anticipate this being focused on the semiconductor industry to start with. And maybe that could expand, but we want to keep this more narrowly focused on kind of core technologies that really matter to national security. This would look similar to the CFIUS process, including the composition of the interagency body, the criteria for blocking a transaction, the ability to impose mitigation terms, the requirement that actions taken under the body be proportional and of last resort, which is important, and also the provision of safe harbor to transactions that clear review. With that overview of our recommendations, we're quite fortunate to have Peter Harrell here to provide us with some thoughts from the vantage point of the Biden administration. And so, Peter, the floor is yours. We'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on where we stand on these.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I really want to begin by thanking Sarah and Emily and Charles for giving me the chance to join all of you today. And it's a pleasure for me to be here, and particularly to be back with CNAS, which is an institution, as you all know, very near and dear to me. And I certainly have tremendous admiration and respect for the Atlantic Council and the many friends and colleagues I have there. I'd like to congratulate CNAS and the Atlantic Council on the release of your new joint report, Sand in the Silicon, Designing an Outbound Investment Controls Mechanism. I know, Charles, in the beginning of your remarks, you said that the report was just released today, and so that the audience probably hasn't had a chance to read it yet, but I was fortunate enough to be able to get an advance copy. Many thanks. And I can say that it's a very thoughtful, timely, and candidly quite helpful report. It provides a framework for thinking about the range of different objectives that a targeted and narrowly scoped outbound investment regime could serve, focusing on key technological competitiveness and national security concerns. And I know I can speak on behalf of my many colleagues thinking about this issue across the administration, as well as myself, when I say that we welcome and appreciate the report and the analysis and recommendations, and we're going to find those useful as we work through our own approach to these issues. I want to make a couple of minutes of remarks today and very much look forward to the panel discussion. And while I know that the report is focused on outbound investment review, and I'm not unaware of the fact that there's keen interest on this topic from a wide range of stakeholders around town and around the country, I'd actually like to begin my remarks with something a little bit different, but also very important, by talking a bit about CFIUS and what we have discovered over a year and a half of running the CFIUS process within the Biden-Harris administration. I should begin by saying that in general, we strongly welcome foreign investment in the US. Indeed, starting last year at the Commerce Department's annual Select USA conference, President Biden resumed the practice of issuing a statement on the investment policy of the United States, which makes clear that we generally welcome foreign investment in the US, which supports millions of American jobs and helps promote US technological and economic competitiveness. President Biden himself, obviously, and his senior advisors have met with companies from Korea to Japan to Europe and other regions to welcome the transformative investments that companies are making in sectors from semiconductors to electric vehicles to renewable technology. That said, on the inbound side, sort of traditional CFIUS, if you will, it is important to review a small percentage of foreign investments being made in the US to ensure that they do not pose national security risks. We've been very active on the CFIUS file. I think CFIUS is in some ways like an iceberg where only the tip is visible above the water. What the public sees is only a tiny fraction of what goes on. As the publicly released CFIUS statistics make clear, the CFIUS committee reviews hundreds of transactions each year, and only a small percentage of those ever become public, consistent with the statute that tries to protect business confidential information. As an administration, we've thought a lot about the CFIUS process, and that has also given us a lot of views and perspectives as we think about outbound, which I'll come to in just a minute. We've been guided by a number of key principles as we've implemented CFIUS, consistent with the relevant statutes. We know that CFIUS should have a national security focus, working to identify specific identifiable risks to national security posed by a transaction. We work to mitigate risks to the extent possible so that we can approve a transaction with mitigation rather than trying to prevent it from being completed. So we have been and continue to be prepared to block transactions when we cannot adequately address the risks. And we've sought to integrate CFIUS with other tools to strengthen our toolkit as a whole. For example, CFIUS might bring to our attention a foreign competitor trying to buy a particular technology, and we can then evaluate whether we should also tighten export controls or whether we should strengthen our own investments in the technology to stay ahead of our competitors. We see CFIUS, potential outbound CFIUS, export controls, and other tools as an integrated whole of a national security toolkit to help promote our own competitiveness and stay ahead of our competitors. I should briefly note a couple of specific areas 18 months into this administration that we've identified as particular areas of focus for CFIUS itself. The first of these is supply chain resilience. President Biden's directed the administration to focus on supply chain resilience since February of last year when he signed EO 14017, directing a set of policies to strengthen key supply chains. And certainly we take that concern into the CFIUS context, where we want to ensure that foreign investments do not make the US vulnerable to future supply chain disruptions of critical goods and services. The second is technological leadership. We're making transformative investments here at home to strengthen US technological leadership, including the CHIPS and Science Bill that the president signed just recently and the Inflation Reduction Act, which he signed even more recently. Although foreign investments can help to foster domestic innovation, we need to make sure that that's what they do, rather than undermining technological leadership. The third is trends in industries. We've noticed that some companies in some countries seem to be making multiple acquisitions in certain industries. And we want to make sure that we understand those trends and mitigate any risks that arise from those trends, in addition to the risks that might be posed by an individual transaction that was not part of a broader trend. Fourth area we focused on is cybersecurity risks, making sure that we do not allow investments by foreign actors who might be seeking to exploit potentially vulnerable cybersecurity nodes. And finally, we've been extremely concerned about risks to US person-sensitive data. This has been true across our policy work. The president last year, for example, signed an executive order directing the Commerce Department to begin reviewing the risks that certain foreign apps and software in the US may pose to the privacy and security of US citizen personal data. And given that lots of US companies hold sensitive US data, CFIUS can play an important role in ensuring that high-risk foreign investors can't use investment to get access to that data. I'd also like to note, when it comes to CFIUS, we've expanded our international engagement on investment screening. This has been both at a strategic level, working with foreign governments to develop effective investment screening regimes and to identify trends in international investments by our competitors. We've recently increased our focus as well on tactical level engagement, trying to better understand early stage deals that are occurring internationally, such as Chinese investments, mining sector in developing countries, so that we can engage early and make sure to mitigate any national security or supply chain or other risks. I'd now like to turn to the topic of the CNAS Atlantic Council report, how to think about the risks posed by certain narrow categories of US investment overseas, kind of the flip side of the CFIUS process that I just discussed. And I want to begin by again congratulating CNAS and the Atlantic Council on the report, which provides a thoughtful framework for considering issues related to outbound investment reporting and potential restrictions. I know there's been a lot of recent press speculation around the administration's intentions on outbound investment review. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to provide details because while, as the National Security Advisor has said publicly since last year, we are considering this issue, no final decisions have been made. We understand the complexity of this issue and have a lot of work ahead of us. But I would like to make a couple of general remarks. The first point I'd like to make is that as a general matter, just as we think foreign investment in the US benefits millions of American workers, we know that US investment abroad benefits US companies, US workers, and the US economy, while strengthening US ties with allies and partners. Our embassies around the world, for example, help US companies make investments in countries from India to Indonesia to France, just as we help open markets to American-made products. These investments are mutually beneficial to our economies and to our strategic relations. That said, we do think there are a handful of narrow areas where investments could potentially pose some risks. And that leads me to my second point. As a CNAS Atlantic Council report notes, the administration has actually already taken steps to limit specific investments in companies where the government is concerned that US investment could benefit China's military or surveillance technology. Last year, for example, President Biden signed EO 14032, updating a prior EO that restricts US firms and US people from investing in the securities of certain Chinese companies that support the Chinese military or surveillance technology. We think that EO provides a valuable tool to ensure that US capital is not supporting specific Chinese firms involved in specific harmful activities. The third point I'd like to make that as we've looked at this issue, and as the CNAS report notes, even beyond what we did with EO 14032, we do think there are gaps in certain USG tools. Take semiconductors, a major focus of the administration, and I think rightly a focus of the CNAS Atlantic Council report. As an administration, we've worked with Congress to secure $52 billion in funding to strengthen semiconductor manufacturing and R&D here in the US. We have an active export control program to ensure that we maintain our technological edge. We work with our allies and partners on multilateral controls and on a multilateral approach to the semiconductor industry. As the CNAS report suggests, against that backdrop, it's important to consider whether and how certain narrowly targeted categories of US investment in foreign competitor semiconductor firms might undermine the effectiveness of these other policy tools. We also have information gaps. As the report notes, we're able to identify information about some private investments in narrow strategic sectors like semiconductors from publicly available data and from commercially available data sources. But the truth is, as a government, we probably don't know as much about what investments are occurring as we should, given the state of US geopolitical competition with China. The third point I'd like to make is that we know that any decisions regarding outbound US investment need to be developed in close consultation with stakeholders. We understand the complexity of the global investment environment. As the CNAS report notes, it is an extremely complex world out there. We understand that US firms need stable investment regimes, and we want to make sure that we've thought through the unintended consequences of any new regulatory regime. As the administration continues to study this issue, we look forward to close dialogue with stakeholders from the private sector, as well as thought leaders and other experts. The fourth point I'd like to make is that as we conveyed in our discussions with Congress during the debate earlier this summer on the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act, we think that any mechanism that would establish authorities over outbound investment should be narrowly tailored and tightly scoped to address identified gaps in existing regimes and specific national security risks. There should be a clear and specific rationale for any regulations or requirements, and they should apply only to specific sectors and types of investments that present clear national security risks. And the final point I'd like to make is that we think there are important lessons to be learned internationally. I think sometimes the rhetoric here in Washington around this issue can portray US discussion of outbound investment as potentially occurring in some kind of international void or being unprecedented internationally. And I think from our perspective, that's simply not true. First, as we've already discussed, the US already has a program under EO 14032 to restrict investments in specific Chinese companies involved in Chinese military or surveillance technology. But perhaps even more importantly, several US partners, for example, Korea, for example, Taiwan, require reporting of certain limited types of investment in China and have tools to try to understand and potentially mitigate risks associated with such investments if they pose a threat to national security. And I actually think we have a lot that we can learn from those examples as we consider our own potential approach. In closing, I'd like to again thank CNAS for giving me the opportunity to speak this morning and to congratulate CNAS and the Atlantic Council on the release of Sand in the Silicon, Designing an Outbound Investment Controls Mechanism. I look forward to hearing all of your views and perspectives in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your remarks. Rather comprehensive, very interesting to go over the experience collected through CFIUS over the past few years, and some of your general remarks on what we might want to see or might want to expect from a potential outbound investment screening mechanism. I will be taking questions from the floor. We already have some very good questions coming in. I'm going to use my traditional prerogative as the moderator to ask a few questions to our wonderful panelists, and then I will be taking and reading questions. We have 8 for the moment. You're very welcome to send some more in. Thank you, everyone. I suppose my first question could be about this data collection point. You mentioned it, Peter, and we also mentioned it in our phase 1 of the report, giving us the visibility we need to bring in outbound investment screening. Could I ask the panel, and so the co-authors and Peter perhaps, just how onerous or easy you would like this process to be? What exactly forms for US investors would need to report? Which US investors are we talking about? I'm very curious to hear, just to jog our imagination a little bit on what this process would look like, if you don't mind, and then we'll go back to some further questions. Thank you.
I'm happy to start off with a few thoughts, and Sarah may want to join as well. I mean, in our proposal, the notification process was intentionally broad, and there's no question that it would require companies to do additional diligence beyond what they're already doing as part of their normal kind of investment due diligence process. For example, one of the requirements that we recommend is that companies report whether or not the Chinese entity in which they would be investing are making technology that would be meet the tech specs of a technology that would be controlled if it was a US origin item. So that's a level of technical diligence that we're not sure companies are doing right now, candidly. And so clearly there would be a bit of a burden. The flip side of that is that under the proposed notification regime, it is strictly notification, right? This is information gathering. And so it's not additionally providing like a clear hook for the government to take action with respect to like this whole range of broad set of transactions that would be subject to the notification requirement. So I think exactly what it looks like, we'll leave that to the government to figure out in terms of like how the form looks. But, I do think there's clearly a need to collect this information, and hopefully companies would be willing to play ball, because the idea is that it would lead to a more narrowly targeted scope of authorities that permit the government to take action, including prohibit transactions. We want to make sure we get that piece of it right.
And just to add on here, we talk in the report about how requiring that firms think about the extent to which any investment that they would be making would go into a Chinese entity that is developing technology or verbing in technology that would be controlled if it originated from the US is a feature, not a bug, in that it is useful for US investors to be thinking about these issues. And so having a reporting requirement around this will make it more likely that they do so. And that is a good thing.
Anything to add, Peter, or we can move on to the next question? All right, thank you. I might ask just two more questions on, as we've gone over phase one, which is about collecting information, basically. Phase two, we might be a bit more restrictive, especially in semiconductors. And then in phase three, we talk about broadening it to other sectors and also trying to convince our allies, given that we will already have a basis of information on the success, hopefully, of our outbound investment mechanism, outbound investment screening mechanism, that they should do it too. So on phase two and semiconductors, I'm just slightly interested in what the co-authors are thinking about enforcement. Once we do have policies with a few more teeth, what would it look like? And I suppose a slightly sort of cheeky question, but we can certainly imagine blocking investments in particular sectors. But we've already mentioned in everyone's remarks just how fungible money is. So we can stop it from going directly to something that we may have a problem with or think is slightly sensitive. But would the money not just find other ways to get to the projects that we're worried about?
So I might work backwards on that question in terms of the fungibility of money piece of things. I mean, obviously, that is one of the primary reasons why this needs to be a conversation with allies. And as Peter noted, we do have close allies who have started to think about these or have already implemented certain mechanisms. But clearly, we need to be talking to the EU, to other major producer nations to make sure that we are mitigating and minimizing that risk wherever possible. Another piece of solving that problem is to not just focus on money, but to focus on money plus something else that that provides an investment-related benefit. So we talk in the report, for example, about investments that give capital, yes, but also give management expertise, that give additional sorts of benefits that may be more resident in the United States, and you're not going to get from just any country. And so it's kind of scoping it tightly to that set of capital flows. So it's not just, dollars in a bank account going from one place to another, which can go anywhere across the globe. It's really focusing on what are the capital and associated benefits and the kind of the smart money aspects of an investment that we're most concerned about capturing. And then Sarah, I'll let her answer the question about kind of enforcement and phase two.
Thanks, Emily. I appreciate you throwing the hardest question out to me. And I'm also really curious to see if Peter wants to weigh in at all. So I would reiterate some of what Emily, or all of what Emily said, along with it's not just talking to allies, but also with the business community. One of the things that we talked a lot about is how do you do enforcement in this context, which is in many ways harder than enforcement for inbound investment, because there you just say, well, you can't invest here. And because money is fungible, it's harder to have enforcement that works as well for outbound. Although, we do anticipate that there are going to be some leaks in the bucket. It's not going to just be a total sieve, right? So that's part of what we have to think about. And one of the things that we also really discussed is the importance of really providing a legitimacy to what is being controlled, right? That when actors, both other countries, but also the business community, believes that there is a real legitimate reason for the US government to stand up these kinds of narrow regulatory tools, it leads to higher levels of voluntary compliance, which is incredibly important because, for the most part, the way that CFIUS works best and CFIUS works well, because most firms, most businesses are voluntarily complying with it. And that's important for designing any tool that's going to ultimately be effective. On the sort of more narrow question of what enforcement actually ends up looking like, this can be a variety of tools, but one thing that it is clear is that there can be there are criminal statutes around these issues, and we see this as well with the EO 14032 that Peter mentioned. So this is not something that would be completely new, but something that we would build on. And that's also one of the reasons why we think it's important to do this in a kind of deliberative and phased approach to build up those authorities and to build legitimacy across our partners, our allies, as well as the business community.
Thanks, Sarah. Perhaps we could tempt Peter to comment in very general terms about your experience, Peter, with enforcement in CFIUS and how to get it done in a way that works well and doesn't affect US competitiveness.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think enforcement is a complex issue. It's certainly one that, whether it's in CFIUS context or whether you're thinking about new regimes, it's one you have to think about carefully. It's frankly one you have to make sure you have resources for, right? And I think there is an element, we have seen since 2018 when FIRMA passed, fortunately, a significant increase in budgetary resources for CFIUS. I think we think about the resource implications for anything else we might do, and enforcement is an important part of the resources, because I think companies, on the one hand, need to understand that there are potential consequences if they violate a regime. On the other hand, they need to understand, particularly when we're looking at something quite complicated, and all of these are very complicated issues, they need to understand that there is going to be a careful and well thought through kind of regulatory process that has lots of kind of opportunities for engagement and ways to work through issues. So I think that as we think about this whole suite of issues, enforcement is always on our minds. And I just want to say I appreciate the comments both Sarah and Emily made on these topics.
Great, thank you. Perhaps one final question for Emily and Sarah on phase 3 before I bundle some of our great questions together. On phase 3, you talk about potentially broadening from semiconductors to new sectors. Any idea what those sectors might be would be appreciated. And then I'll start bundling questions together. Everyone's encouraged still to add questions. We've got some great ones here, but I'm sure we can deal with a few more as well. Thank you.
The easy way to answer that question, Charles, is just to say, well, let's see what the notifications bring in, and that is part of the answer, right? Part of the reason to do the notifications is to identify where there are capital flows that are presenting genuine national security risk. But to expand on that a little bit, I mean, I do think we know enough now to know that there certainly are concerns around US investments in, for example, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, really technologies that are emerging now that will be key enabling technologies in the future. And candidly, where we know China already has some significant capability. And so we really are in kind of a foot race here to make sure that the United States does have a leadership role and that we are retaining the most amount of sensitive technologies. One of the reasons that we didn't include those in phase 2, where we talk about chips, is one, just getting chips up and running will be a big lift. And so the idea of the phased approach was to figure out the institutional processes, get the staffing and resource and political leadership in place for one very critical sector, chips, which is relatively easy to define. And in our paper, we define it as not just the chips, but also the electronic design software and the manufacturing equipment. So that's a big chunk of activity to try to wrap your head around. And then moving forward, when you get into sectors like artificial intelligence or quantum, you get into much harder definitional issues. There's going to need to be a lot of engagement with the private sector to understand what kind of investments are being made, where does the United States really have an edge, and how do you create bright line rules so that companies know what they're actually complying with? I mean, that kind of gets to our discussion around enforcement as well. Part of enforcement is making sure that companies have very clear guidance on what's in and what's out. And so those are all of the reasons why we thought that some of those more complicated issues around emerging technologies that we know are going to be quite important in the future, are pushed to a later phase.
Sarah, you're on mute.
Let me just add in here that one way to think about this is thinking about kind of network effects in these kinds of technological advancements and looking for choke point technologies. So I, for one, am like nervous about discussions of controlling AI, just because AI is such a broad category that can mean lots of different things. And I think in general, it's much harder to control software than it is hardware. If you think about semiconductors and kind of thinking about lithographic printing machines that are really important in kind of higher processes, those are the sorts of things that that's the type of way of thinking about, what are the technologies that, that can be controlled and then, should be controlled. And so, I think quantum is a really good place to be looking next. A lot of people also have their discussions about biotechnology, and I think there are good reasons for that. There, for a variety of reasons, that tends to be a area that gets some pushback with respect to more controls. But those are areas that I would look to. But again, you can't control everything, right? And especially in order to have a regime that is seen as legitimate broadly, you need to be able to make the case that there are kind of more narrow, that national security in a more narrow sense is affected by these technologies. And in order to get over the hump of some of these enforcement problems that we also were talking about, you need to kind of stay very focused. And so I would just encourage the US government to not kind of go out there trying to control everything. One other just quick point, I think Emily made it before, but I want to reiterate it. It's very easy. Oftentimes these discussions get focused on what are the risks of investing abroad, but we also need to think about what are the risks to national security about closing up, right? And so we need to balance that. And it could be very problematic for the kind of the primacy of U.S. technological primacy. If we kind of over control, it could create a environment that would be not conducive to additional technological innovation and development. And so we really do need to kind of push back against the urge to over control.
Thank you. I'm going to start taking the questions that have been sent in. Thank you, everyone, for sending questions. Keep them coming. We've had a few questions from William Norris, who has to jump in a few minutes to teach, so I thought we'd give him, we'd read his question first. It's also a very good question that is addressed in the report. I've also had the privilege of reading it, to do with who actually does this. Should it be Commerce? Should it be Treasury? Should it be the SEC? Amusingly, all of these potential candidates are mentioned in the report, and their various merits are gone over too. So I'll leave it to Sarah and Emily to tell William what the report says and what your recommendation is on that.
Yeah, so in the report, we do recommend that this function be housed in the Treasury Department. We do think that Treasury is quite good at implementing investment screening. We urge policymakers to think about not lumping this into the existing CFIUS process, which already has an immense workload, including with the new FIRMA requirements. But when you think about an agency that has experience in this sort of risk assessment, it's got also the sanctions component, which I think is relevant just in terms of how you think about enforcement and intelligence gathering. It seems to make a lot of sense to place it within Treasury, perhaps as a sister office to the existing Office of Investment Security that does the inbound investment screening. Clearly, though, Treasury should not be a sole arbiter here, right? It needs to be an interagency process to really get to the right sort of risk assessments. commerce will have a big role to play, particularly as we're talking about how this aligns with export controls. The Department of Defense will have a big role. So there does need to be a core, not too big, but kind of a core group of agencies who will be kind of critical partners in this effort. But our sense is that the right place likely is the Treasury Department.
Thanks a lot. We have a question from Martin Czemper to do with what the controls actually mean. So if products, particular investments into particular sectors are controlled, does that mean there could be exemptions under license? Does that mean we ultimately want to block any kind of investment? Does that mean the controls would come in only in particular cases once the notification has come in? So I think Martin is trying to get a sense of just how tough the controls would be once we're in phases 2 and 3. Thank you.
I'll start by saying that at least on the kind of first stage, we again want to be relatively broad, right? So I think that what we would be really looking for is if there is a, if there is a control, if you need to get a license, then you need to notify. And once we move into actual review, again, because the review would be very narrowly scoped to a few technologies that we really think are most important. Again, if you need a license to export that technology, then you should also have to go through a review process for investing abroad. Emily?
Yeah, it's a good question because in the different phases, there's actually different designs of particular controls. So in the first phase, one of the controls that we suggest is that if the Chinese entity receiving the investment is making an item that would be subject to a complete arms embargo in the United States. So if a Chinese company is making tanks, the United States should not have any investors investing in that company. And that would be a flat prohibition. And hopefully that's a pretty unarguable sort of bright line prohibition there. And so there we would expect that would just be kind of a very clear black and white sort of rule. Moving into the later phases, it is more of a genuine screen. So it's not so much about coming in and getting a license, but it's about like how the CFIUS process currently works. It's a screening process where you notify about the transaction, the government looks at it, and then decides whether it's going to approve with mitigation, or prohibit in the extreme cases where that sort of thing is necessary. So there are a couple of different design pieces in there for how it would work for particular sets of transactions.
Thanks very much. We're getting a few more questions, I think, from the concerned private stakeholders, i.e. investors. So some of our questions, including from Joseph Vaughan and from another anonymous attendee, are to do with who exactly this would affect. Would it affect VC investors? Would it affect hedge funds? Would it affect investment allocators? I think a lot of people are trying to get a sense of just how large the spectrum of private sector stakeholders would be. And given they're the front line for this potential policy, they're, I suppose, trying to scope whether they'd be concerned or not, and in which phases.
I'm happy to take this, but I also would love if Peter is at all interested in talking about how the administration is thinking about this issue, if you feel comfortable sharing.
So I'm not in a position where I can give a lot of detailed comment on this, other than to make a few general points. First, I think, as we think about this issue, we are guided by a principle, and frankly, I think the CNAS Atlantic Council report does a really great job of laying this out. We're guided by a principle of we really should be focused on a handful of areas where there are, extremely sort of sensitive national security linked technologies and products, right? So if you're not investing in an industry, like, for example, in CNAS report and Atlantic Council report talks about semiconductors, you're not investing in one of those industries, this is going to be kind of irrelevant to you anyway, right? So that's kind of the first point I would make, because I think it's only going to affect investors. It would only affect investors who are focused on a handful of specific areas. I think in terms of the types of sort of types of investor on the sort of kinds of funds, kinds of community, I would say no decisions have been made. I mean, no decision has been made of this altogether. We are here to kind of learn and understand the different perspectives that are out there. I would note that on the CFIUS front, it is primarily the deal parties who are responsible for coming in, right? I mean, it's if you are going through CFIUS, it's the company being acquired and the acquirer, and it's not kind of all sorts of parties way out in the transaction. I mean, there may have to be information disclosed about the parties way out in the transaction. And I would just note, obviously, I think the investors are obviously the ones who are best positioned to be able to provide the kinds of information that might be of interest.
Thanks very much. We have a few questions about how this might fit in with the administration's broader attempts to re-engage with allies, TTC, IPEF. I have a question from Abe-san on how this might interact with the IPEF conversation. You also mentioned, Peter, that this policy idea isn't unprecedented, that the Republic of Korea and Taiwan already have such measures in place for investment in China. So I think Abe-san is getting at how this can be folded holistically into the IPEF process. And we're very curious to see if you have any remarks on that.
Look, I'll be very candid. We are in the process of, thinking through an administration approach to this issue. The Hill was also, as we've discussed, been quite interested in this issue. I think it is kind of, frankly, very premature to talk about how, a potential tool that does not yet exist in the United States would be folded into various multilateral processes. So I just think it's wildly premature to have that kind of a discussion. I do think it is important for us, as I said in my opening remarks, to learn from the experiences of allies and partners who have already done some things in this space. And that's certainly a set of discussions and diplomatic engagements we're having. And I also think that, as we continue to evaluate what we as an administration and what Congress may want to do, I do think it's important that we have, a set of diplomatic dialogues with our allies and partners so that we can kind of understand foreign perspectives on this, so that we can help mitigate unintended consequences, so we can explain what we're doing. But I think it's really very premature to sort of spin out hypotheticals.
All right. We have another question for Peter from another Peter who is former NSC. So former NSC to current NSC. Peter Dean is asking about the risks of setting up such processes with the more or less explicit goal of mitigating risk from Chinese investments. How the administration is thinking about the knock-on effects and whether China might force like-minded countries or non-aligned countries into choosing between investing in China and investing in the US. And perhaps whether you've seen any evidence of that in the opposite direction. So since CFIUS, has there been any evidence of China forcing non-aligned countries to choose between accepting investment from China and from the US? This one's for Peter.
No, look, I think the important thing for us is to have a good set of dialogue with stakeholders, both domestically and internationally, so we can make sure we are not, inadvertently creating challenges we didn't expect, and so we can understand potential reactions and collateral costs. So I really don't have a lot to comment on that. We are in the process of listening and hearing perspectives as we refine our own thinking on this issue.
We're very grateful you've listened to our report as well. We have some questions about proposals that have already been out there in Washington. So the Casey Cornin proposal was mentioned in the remarks, or the several iterations of it. So I suppose this might be a question for Sarah and Emily, how this report resembles or has similarities with what Senators Casey and Cornin put out, and how it differs and how it might be better. Thank you.
I won't take that loaded question of whether it's better or not. I mean, this is the approach that we thought was right now based on where the conversations are. I think we're grappling with many of the same issues. I mean, clearly the proposal that we put forward in our paper is different than the conversations that were happening on the Hill. Although, as those conversations proceeded and the Hill drafters took on more stakeholder input, that project was moving in a more targeted, narrowly scoped direction. I mean, there's still work to do, obviously, but like that, it was, that's part of the process. I mean, I think in terms of where we landed, I mean, ours is clearly a more phased approach, with a heavier emphasis in the earlier phases on just information gathering and building the process. Whereas some of the Hill proposals would kind of institute authority sooner rather than later, with kind of the institutional processes catching up afterwards. So I see that as kind of one of the main differences, as well as I think some of the how one would scope the specific sets of transactions, commercial transactions that would be covered. I think our proposal is more narrowly scoped in that sense. Some versions of some of the Hill drafts, particularly the earlier Hill drafts, had language around influence and that sort of thing, which is really hard to describe and clarify in clear, bright line rules. And so we tried to steer away from some of those more ambiguous, broad-based terms that would be really hard for private companies to comply with, and frankly for the government to enforce. So I think in large part we benefited from some of those conversations that were happening on the Hill, and tried to address some of the concerns that came up in that process in the paper that we put forward.
Sarah, anything to add?
I think Emily did a great job. Just to kind of circle back to some of the other kind of questions that were asked, those and kind of tie it together, is that one of the things that I think is really important here is that, especially when that definitions always really matter, right? So Emily talked about kind of influence and kind of how to think about affiliation. And when we talk about this outbound screen, I think the kind of modal idea is that this is about investment that is going from the US to a place that is physically in China. But depending on how definitions are written, what happens if a US investor is trying to invest in, Volvo R&D in Europe, right? And so because of ownership, ultimate beneficial ownership, we may be kind of bringing in a lot more types of investment in a lot of other places into review. And so we really need to think very carefully about how to do this and how to engage with partners and allies around this process, because it could quickly become much more expansive than a lot of people are thinking about. And so kind of in general, kind of moving, this is another reason why we're really focused on narrowing the scope conditions here, that we really do want to pursue, a small yard, high fence type framework to what we end up doing with outbound controls or screening.
Thank you. We still have about 10 minutes, just under 10 minutes. So if anyone wants to ask some further questions, please do so now. We're starting to get a few questions from Mr. Hussein Sert and a few others on allies and how they are thinking about this issue of outbound investment screening. Peter mentions some processes that already exist in Asia, but could our co-authors speak to the appetite that they detect in the EU and elsewhere for this kind of mechanism? Is there any appetite, or is it, in fact, have they shown a lack of interest and even a sense of dread about such a measure? I mean, I think it really depends on which individual capital in the EU you might talk to. So any context on that would be very helpful. And some of the other countries that Mr. Sert is interested in are Israel and Turkey. So if our co-authors can comment on any of those, that would be most welcome.
I'm happy to share perspectives just based on the conversations I've had, which, of course, may be very different than kind of official government positions and what U.S. government officials may be hearing in different channels. But I do think there's hesitancy, if I may be so bold as to categorize an EU opinion on this, right? Recognizing that consists of a lot of different views. I think there's a lot of questions about whether there's a need for this sort of mechanism, a lot of questions about how this is not duplicative of export controls, concerns about how disruptive this sort of outbound investment mechanism could be, kind of recognizing that the EU and China do have a really large commercial relationship as well. And so in many respects, those are some of the very concerns that we heard in the United States when we were having these debates as well. And so our sense is that these are not insurmountable concerns. I mean, keep in mind the EU did not have an inbound investment screening mechanism until a few years ago. And it was really the result of some very dedicated technocratic diplomacy, partnered with political support from the United States to kind of have these sorts of conversations, where you do see a lot more countries having inbound investment screening mechanisms. And so I do think there's a lot of work to be done on that front, to talk with allies at the appropriate time in the appropriate forum when the United States has a position that it's ready to move forward with, to think about how our approach does address a very real set of risks, why we do see a clear gap in authorities, and what we think is kind of the best way forward in terms of partnering with allies. But I do think with some of these relationships, we are much earlier in those sorts of conversations, and haven't made as much progress as perhaps we would like in terms of persuading other allies. But we haven't even set up our own mechanism yet, so work to do on the U.S. front as well. I'm candidly not as familiar with the Israel and Turkey cases, so I will punt on that question unless Sarah has views on that.
I also, similar to Emily, my experience talking with EU officials is that there's, this is going to be a heavy lift. Part of the reason why we emphasize data collection in the first phase of our approach is precisely because if there is going to be movement in Europe, at least, there needs to be some kind of clear examples of how something bad happened in Europe without an outbound screen. And so providing some, clear data is going to be very helpful here in determining what, if anything, is needed to be done, and then bringing partners and allies along. Of course, one other thing that that we shouldn't forget is that as Peter mentioned, there are other countries, other allies of ours who have some form of outbound screening. And so one way to build some coalitions around this is to start with those who already have these mechanisms in place, and to work to build coalitions through those. One kind of thing that I will mention, though, that with Europe and the EU, one thing that oftentimes gets downplayed, but was really important for kind of creating a large kind of group of EU actors who became more interested in screening, was also concerns among especially Eastern European countries about investment from Russia. And so when we're thinking about outbound investment, just for right now, that's a little bit less of a concern at the moment. And so thinking about what coalitions will sustain an outbound screen in the EU context is a little bit harder to get to. On the issue of Israel, all I can say with that, I was actually just recently in Israel and talking to some over there about investment screening, and they, currently have a very narrow kind of inbound screen. It's going to be hard there as well to think about outbound screens. And when it comes to technology, that really matters because Israel is so advanced in technology. I have less to say on Turkey, so I won't attempt it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
One last a second on that.
Please, please go ahead.
I want to come in for just a second on the allies and partners question. Look, because I think, I think the European Union, I think other allies and partners, just as we here in the United States do, understand this issue of outbound investment is an extremely complicated one that has to be considered very carefully and with a lot of thought as to what unintended consequences might be. But I guess, my lived experience over the last 18 months or 20 months or whatever it is now in this administration, is that there has been and continues to be a kind of profound sea change in Europe on their approach to China issues, right? And it's been interesting to see them take a couple of steps that are frankly ahead of the United States in terms of how they deal with various forms of Chinese practices that they see as threatening their security, right? So Europe in the last year has tabled, and I think will be moving forward to adopting a sort of formal anti-coercion instrument after they see after they see China engage in economic coercion in Lithuania. They have tabled and are carrying forward, and I think it's interesting because it's a CFIUS related thing. It's an inbound thing. They have tabled and are adopting and implementing an anti-subsidies instrument, which actually creates a kind of economic security nexus to their CFIUS process that we frankly don't have in the United States, right? They are now empowered to review a Chinese investment or other foreign investment in Europe on the basis that it is benefiting from unfair subsidies in its home market. That's actually not something that CFIUS would traditionally consider because it wouldn't be seen as a national security factor. So it's been quite interesting to me to see this sea change, the way the Europeans in their own system have actually grappled with a range of Chinese challenges, actually taken steps that we have not yet taken here in the United States to grapple with some of those challenges. And I think actually gives me, sort of a lot of hope that there is room for a very constructive dialogue on this issue and sort of all aspects of investment issues, because I think they recognize, just as we recognize, that we are still in the kind of early days of a era of geopolitical great power competition, and that it is incumbent on us to build a set of tools for the long term to have in our toolkit for that era of great power competition. Look, I don't think that means this is going to be easy. I don't think that means they're going to sort of sign up and necessarily do exactly what we might do here, but I do think it creates some space for a very constructive set of dialogues and engagements.
Great. Thank you, Peter. So we're approaching the end of this very interesting session. So I'd like to give all our participants the opportunity to make some closing remarks. There's one last minute question we didn't address, which was to do with who this would actually concern. What is a US individual? What is a US entity? There's something that we were thinking of mentioning in this event we didn't get around to, which was the question of subsidiaries. So if one of you, Emily or Sarah, it could, in your closing remarks, if you don't mind, take care of that. I'd be very grateful. But yes, everyone, all three of you have an opportunity to make about 30-40 seconds of closing remarks, and then we'll finish. Thank you. Starting with Emily.
So I think the short answer on subsidiaries is yes, they should be captured. But the trick is, how do you capture subsidiaries going up to a U.S. owner, but not inadvertently apply this mechanism in a hugely extraterritorial way, kind of outside the bounds of U.S. jurisdiction. So that's a scoping question that we address more in the paper. But yes, I think in order to make sure that this mechanism works and is not easily evaded, you do need to think about how to capture subsidiaries. But in terms of closing remarks, besides thanking everyone at the Atlantic Council team and Peter again one more time, I would just encourage everyone as they think about the outbound investment issue to really zoom out and to really think about how this fits in to the range of policies that the United States and allies are pursuing right now, which includes all of the variety of economic statecraft tools. It includes our diplomatic relationships. It includes our keen interest in making sure that U.S. companies remain globally competitive, and how controls kind of fit into that bigger picture. It's really easy, and I think regulators, as a someone who used to be in these processes, it's really easy to see discrete problems and want to hammer them as hard as you can in your narrow lane. And I would just encourage us all to kind of keep that big picture perspective in mind, so that when we come to an outbound investment mechanism, it is something that is very tightly targeted and proportionate to the one piece of the problem that we think that this tool can fix.
Thank you. Sarah, in 40 seconds, if you don't mind.
So I want to again thank everyone for coming today, and thank Emily and Charles and Josh and Maya and Emily over at CNAS for all of their work on this I think really important issue. I would just say two things, right? Narrow, right? That the more kind of narrowly scoped, the more legitimate an outbound investment screening mechanism is going to be. And then also, just as CFIUS is supposed to be and normally is really a tool of last resort, we should think of any outbound screen as well as a tool of last resort. This sort of relates to Emily's point about thinking big picture, that it is very easy to start to think about all the ways in which we can use new tools very aggressively, but we need to think about potential negative consequences. And so we should really approach this issue with a degree of humility.
And over to you, Peter.
I'm just going to end by thanking CNAS and the Atlantic Council for this really tremendously timely and thoughtful report. I know it's going to be read widely around town and across the administration. And I want to thank everyone for the very thoughtful and open discussion that we have had today. It has certainly been valuable for my thinking, and I'm sure will continue to inform our discussions going forward. So thank you all very, very much for giving me the opportunity to join, and congratulations.
Thank you. I will also thank everyone who's involved in making this event possible. The original roundtable participants, our teams at Center for a New American Security and the Atlantic Council, the events teams, especially Maya Nicoladze, my colleague from the Economic Statecraft Initiative, who shepherded the whole process through publications and also setting up this event. Maya also put out our latest edition of the Global Sanctions Dashboard last week, so everyone should take a look at that. Perhaps not exactly related to outbound investment mechanism, a more old-fashioned tool of economic statecraft, but interesting nonetheless. And a final plug, if I may, for our Frankfurt Forum on the 28th of September. I believe a link is being put in the dialogue box as I speak. All of these issues will come up. Of course, people can tune in online, but everyone who has gone to the trouble of listening to us on Zoom this morning can also get in touch with us, and we'll probably be able to accommodate you in person. So thank you so much for dialing in. Thank you to all our panelists, and see you soon. I think we're off. Thank you very much.